Wind Waker is a very broken Zelda game, as players are able to swim across the sea at super speeds, skip the Great Barrier, and even fly. And while these are fantastic breakthroughs, the game has a history of glitches getting 99% of the way to being useful, only to reach a dead end. Take Makar Skip, or what would be Makar Skip. The hook shot is one of the best items for the speedrun, but it's inside of an endgame dungeon, and while there are tricks to get inside of this dungeon early, you're also required to get Makar. As there are 2 doors in the Wind Temple he's required to open. In addition to Makar, you also need to get the command melody, which is in the Tower of the Gods. So any skip that lets you get through the 2 Makar doors would be huge for the speedrun, as getting the hook shot removes the need for the difficult zombie hover at the end, saving almost an hour. Another glitch that's close to being game-breaking is actor unloading, where due to a memory leak, it's possible to unload any actor in the game, from cutscenes to doors and even the Great Barrier itself, but this glitch is so volatile and random that it's not reliable, and you're more likely to softlock or crash than unload what you want. However, a third glitch that's been known about since 2013 but was poorly understood recently had a player look into what was going on with it, and the results were the most powerful glitch that Wind Waker had ever seen, cutting almost 30 minutes off the speedrun. And to understand how all of this happened, let's rewind to 2013. Wind Waker is a great game, and one thing I always wished was that they created more content for it. And while that's unlikely to happen, this video's sponsor, Old School RuneScape, did just launch some new content, the Gridmaster. Gridmaster is a bingo-inspired solo event where you need to navigate a 7x7 grid of tiles, with each tile having a unique challenge for you, from skilling to questing and even mini-games. And if you're just starting out, don't worry. For this event, everyone starts with a fresh account, so the playing field is completely level. By completing a tile, you get cool rewards like XP boosts, quest completions, relics, and more. And if you complete a full row or column, you get access to even greater rewards. The contest runs from October 15th to November 12th, and it's open to everyone, with free-to-play players having the opportunity to complete a full column and get a sample of what the grid has to offer. Try Old School RuneScape's new community event, Gridmaster, by going to the link below and start completing tiles on your bingo card now. And with that, let's get back to the video. In 2013, the Wind Waker speedrun was in its infancy, but there were skips and glitches being found, and storage is one of them. Storage is a glitch that affects the next event that occurs in the game, so to understand what it does, let's look at how events work. In simple terms, the game can be divided into 2 states: gameplay, where the player has control of Link, and everything else, with cutscenes, dialogue, opening chests, and anytime the camera switches or the player doesn't have control of Link falling into the other or cutscene category. To keep track of what state the player is in, the game uses a variable called the storage flag, which is set to 1 if Link is in gameplay, or 0 if he's in a cutscene. So when you talk to an NPC, this value gets set to 0, letting the game know you no longer have control of Link, and when these sequences end, it then gets set back to 1. This should be an airtight system. However, players found many ways to flip this value, and while forest water storage and soup storage are both cool names, they use the same principles as dry storage, which is the most widely used method. For dry storage, you need to find a spot where the camera will do a 180 when you pull out the Wind Waker, then cancel the pullout and hit the first note of the Wind Waker before it's cancelled while walking off a ledge. If you're successful, you'll be in gameplay with a storage flag value of 0. This is because the game tried to put you into the Wind Waker cutscene, so it made the value 0, but because it wasn't exited properly, the game never switched the flag back. And while you're in this state, all sorts of weird things can happen. Collision is one of the major things that's affected, resulting in storage being used throughout the speedrun, such as using chest storage to walk up to Helmarok's room early, or in the Earth Temple, where it's used to get out of bounds to hit multiple load zones and skip almost everything. Suffice it to say, storage has lots of different ways to be activated and is used a lot, but there was one instance that wasn't understood very well, and that's in Zephos skip. In regular gameplay, you're supposed to interact with these 2 stones, then talk to Zephos during a cutscene to unlock the Wind's Requiem, but by using storage, you can skip the cutscene. Back in 2013, Zephos skip was used to save a few seconds over watching the cutscene. However, every now and then, runners found that Zephos skip would fail, or in some cases, they would get half of the skip to work without knowing why. But in May of 2025, glitch hunter and runner Trog decided to look into it. Originally, after activating storage, runners would talk to the King of Red Lions, which causes some weird effects around text boxes. But Trog found a different text box that made the trick more consistent, and not fully understanding why this was the case, he asked other glitch hunters to take a look, and LegendofLuke found something that was previously thought impossible. During his investigation, he was able to stack two text boxes on top of each other, which should have been impossible, since anytime you open a text box, the storage flag was supposed to get flipped. However, here was proof that something was amiss. Looking further into the double text box, Legend found something else, a crash, and at this point, Trog decided to dig into what was causing it, and the culprit was something that completely surprised him. In normal gameplay, the pictobox is used to take pictures of the environment and is required to complete the pictograph quest that Lenzo sends you on. But when Trog looked at what was causing the crash, he found that data from the pictobox was overwriting data in the text box. To understand why this was happening, we first need to understand pointers. Pointers are used in programming to store the memory address of another variable. However, if the memory address the pointer is referencing gets deleted and a new program uses the memory without the pointer being told that its reference was changed, it will use whatever data replaced its reference. This is called a dangling pointer or stale reference, and the crash was happening because the second text box had a pointer that was pointing to the memory address of the pictobox, leading the game to crash when it was closed, since the pictobox code doesn't know how to close a text box. Anytime there's a stale reference, there's the possibility of a glitch called arbitrary code execution, or ACE, where you get the game to run code that it's not supposed to, and in speedruns, this is usually created by players using a stale reference. Since the second text box had a stale pointer looking at pictobox data, Trog's hope was that this data could be used to make a credits warp. But when he looked at it, the data appeared to be useless for that purpose, so he took a different approach. He asked for players to use the text stacking glitch in lots of different ways, so that if they found a crash, he could debug it with the hope that the stale reference was using data he was able to control, and runner Minimini352 sent him one that was quite interesting. It only happened if Link had a perfect camera angle, but when Trog looked at the data for the stale reference, it wasn't using regular pictobox data. Instead, it was using data from the pixels of a picture that had been taken with the pictobox. This was huge, since all you had to do to change the data would be to change what you were taking a picture of. But Trog had a big problem. The code that controls what the pictobox outputs as picture data is very complex, and he needed a way to decipher it. But luckily for him, there's a Wind Waker decomp. Unfortunately, the decomp is only 50% complete, so he consulted the team behind it, and they told him that reverse engineering this data is possible, but the algorithm behind it is very complicated. And for this video's purpose, all you need to know is that they managed to crack how it was working. Which leaves one question: would Trog be able to use this knowledge to write a credits warp from pictograph data? With the help of the decomp team, they did find a pictograph that had the correct data for a credits warp, but it had two problems. The first is that this payload only worked on the Japanese version of the game, and it required using the DX Pictobox, which brings us to problem 2. The DX Pictobox allows you to take color photos, and after investigating potential payloads, they determined that it was the color data of a pictograph that was being used for the stale reference, which made it very hard to find the correct data to use for a credits warp. However, Wind Waker has more than just the Japanese version, so Azer67 looked into the PAL version, but unfortunately, that version didn't work at all, as the stale reference wasn't even using pictobox data. This left the North American version as the final hope, and when it was checked, the data was tied to pictographs. Specifically, it was using the brightness data of the pixels. After consulting the decomp team, they estimated that the luck you would need to get the data for a credits warp from taking random pictures would be absolutely insane and barely in the realm of possibility. To quote Dumb and Dumber, "So you're saying there's a chance." And with the theoretical knowledge fully explored, Trog and the community got to work on finding an in-game setup to make it happen. But first, they had 3 problems to solve. First, they needed to find a location in memory to store the payload they planned on creating. Second, they needed to find an address in memory they could manipulate to get the game to go to that payload and execute it. And third, they needed the pixel data of the pictograph to align with the memory address in step 2 so they could initiate the glitch. For problem 1, they ended up storing the payload where the game stores controller data, with the theory being once they jump execution to that location, they could use controller inputs to then execute it. To help solve problem 2, Trog found a list of memory addresses that would work for getting the game's execution to the payload, and most of these addresses were tied to Link's position data, so the plan changed slightly to have the stale reference read pictograph data, then jump to reading Link's position, which would then send it to controller data. However, this still left problem 3, and getting pictograph data to be read as any of these addresses was difficult. The pixel data being read couldn't be just anywhere in the pictograph. The specific pixels needed to be contained in this 4x4 box. So to make this easier, the decomp team made a ROM hack that would take several pictures, then scan them for a pixel value that worked. Alright, that was a lot of technical info, so here's an overview of how it works. First, a credits warp payload is written by taking a very specific pictograph. Then, after stacking 2 text boxes, one of them is closed to create the stale pointer. Then by pulling out the picto box, the stale pointer gets overwritten by the pixel data from the pictograph, which tells it to read Link's position data, sending the game's execution to controller data. And finally, the controller is used to tell the game to execute the payload and play the credits. This sounds great in theory, but in practice it turned out to be very difficult, and one major problem was getting the pictograph payload to work. One idea the community had was to use the file name instead, which is a common solution as it's used in Paper Mario and other games, but for Wind Waker it had problems. English has less characters than Japanese, which means there's fewer options for what can be read as machine code. Additionally, the file name on Wind Waker is very short, which limits what you can input, and during this investigation they realized something else. While the theory behind what they wanted to do was sound, there was a big issue once they had the game reading controller inputs. They couldn't find a way to execute the payload. It seemed like after so much time and effort, all hope was lost. But on the dawn of the 5th day, Trog looked east outside his window and saw MrCheeze riding in to save the day. You may have heard of MrCheeze, as he was involved in the Paper Mario Stop and Swap credits warp, Majora's Mask credits warp, and many other ace glitches in speedrunning. And just like in those other instances, he had a mad scientist idea for making this work. Instead of telling the game to play the credits, he discovered that there's a line of code that asks if the player is in a new stage, but if this line of code is never read, the game will default to playing the credits. So, rather than write a complicated payload, he was going to delete that line of code, then go to a new area to trigger a credits warp with the game's own logic. This was a beautiful solution, but the setup was something else entirely, as it required using 4 controllers to feed inputs to the game once execution was jumped to them. And unfortunately, while this did work, it wouldn't be possible for a human, as the inputs required inhuman timing. With this method proven, a glitch hunter named ShadowQC started working with MrCheeze to make this humanly possible, and together they came to a solution that would have controllers 2, 3, and 4 all get set in specific states before the run so that their data was ready to go. And not long after, they created a task that achieved the credits warp. All that was left was for someone to do it on a console. One problem an RTA runner was going to have was finding a setup for taking a pictograph with the correct data. And motivated by Shadow and MrCheeze's success, EJ125 ran a tool on console that scanned for a good image, and in August he found one. And not long after, a setup was found. Wanting to prove this was possible, EJ did a run where he used a cheat code to set the values of the controllers, and not long after, he warped to the credits. So with the theory completely proven, the race was on to see who could do this without cheats, with Minimini and EJ running attempts alongside each other, and Minimini quickly got on a run. Looking back at our overview, we see a few things have changed with this new RTA setup, so here's how it works. Instead of setting up the initial payload with the picto box, controller inputs are used to set up the payload before the run starts. The picto box still plays a role, however, as the pixel data from the pictograph is used to jump execution to Link's position data. But it also has another function. Once storage is set up with an NPC's text box, players keep the NPC off screen to prevent its code from triggering. Then, by using the picto box, they bring the NPC back on screen, where he tries to run his code to delete the text box. The pictograph data then loads in, and the stale pointer becomes active at Link's position data. Then, they stand Link at a precise position, which tells the game to read controller data, and once this happens, it deletes the special line of code, so the next time Link goes into a house or dungeon, he'll be warped to the credits. In terms of the speedrun, the only items required are the Wind Waker and the Picto Box, so from Outset Isle, Minimini super swims to Dragon Roost Isle to pick up the Wind Waker from King of Red Lions, then super swims to Windfall Island to meet everyone's favorite character Tingle and grab the Picto Box. After that, he needs to do a precise setup to take the pictograph, then do the loading shenanigans with the NPC and Picto Box to jump execution to Link's position data. Then, he gets into a precise position, which jumps the game's execution to controller data, where the payload setup before the run tells it to delete that special line of code. And after all of that, all he has to do is enter a door. Before I show you the end, I just want to stress how lucky all of this is, as once the game is reading data from Link's position, it's a pure miracle that it doesn't crash, as any value can theoretically tell it to do something it shouldn't be able to. But through the effort of the community, on September 1st, Minimini was able to complete the first credits warp in Wind Waker history.
Holy yes! Let's fucking go.
Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next exciting episode of Abyssoft Z.